Thank you for downloading this podcast from the Forum for Philosophy. Subscribe for weekly discussions of science, culture, politics, and the arts from a philosophical perspective. The Forum is a non-profit organisation, and our events are free and open to all. You can support our work via our website and Facebook page.
Okay, good evening and thank you very much for coming out to this event. This is the Forum for Philosophy's event on the ethical human. So this evening we're going to discuss the ethical human and the emergence of ethical thinking and practice and those kinds of topics. This event forms part of the Shape of the World series held in the run-up to the LSE Festival, which is going to be a week-long series of events taking place from May the 2nd to Saturday 7th March of 2027, or 2020, sorry, 2027 would be far away. It's free to attend and open to all, and exploring how social sciences can make the world a better place. The full programme will be available online from January 2020. Okay, so the event and our topic for this evening is the ethical human. So we're going to be looking at the concept of the ethical human, thinking about ethics from various points of view, including philosophy, comparative psychology, developmental psychology, and try and get some clarity on these kinds of concepts using this kind of expertise. So we've got some experts with us to help us do that, who I'll introduce now. So this is Zanna, who is Assistant Professor of Comparative and Developmental Psychology at Durham University, Simone, Schnall, who is Reader in Experimental Social Psychology at the University of Cambridge, and Philip Pettit, who is LS Rockefeller University Professor of Politics and Human Values at Princeton University and Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University. So given that we are the Forum for Philosophy, I'm going to take the privilege of starting with philosophy this evening. So Philip, would you mind getting us started with some introductory words on ethics? What's a good working definition? What are we worried about when we were worrying about ethics?
Okay, that's a big ask, but there you are. I guess the two things I associate with ethics, first of all, is obviously ethical behaviour as we think of it, which is broadly altruistic behaviour that is not just in your own interest, or maybe, of course, but in the interest of other people. But, of course, and that's, I suspect, a theme that's going to come up in these discussions, it doesn't make you an ethical creature just to behave in an altruistic way. There's evidence of altruistic behaviour across various species apart from ours. I take it that human beings are ethical in a distinctive way. And with us, it's not just that we at least aspire to behave ethically or altruistically. We also have standards and have a sense of being required by these standards to behave in that way. So there are two levels. There's ethics as a sort of regulative way of thinking, and there's ethics as the behavioral counterpart of that way of thinking. Now, it's not that when, so to speak, we are ethically minded and behave ethically, it's not as if we go around just checking against the standards. I think often we behave ethically just out of habit or second nature or training or background or instincts that I think we'll see are shared with other species as well. But we have these standards always there as a check. And if we behave in a way that doesn't correspond to them, I think a red light goes on. Hopefully it goes on for ourselves. I mean, that if I do something, God, that's really unfair. It strikes me, the red light goes on, and then I can regulate by the standard. And if the red light flag doesn't go up for me, somebody else is going to raise it, as in, that's not fair. And even, as we know, 3-year-old children will hear about that too, I imagine, already say, as we're all aware, that's not fair. They give a sense of fairness. So I would say the behaviour and the standards are two aspects of being an ethical creature, and certainly human beings in that sense are ethical creatures.
And so do you think the philosophical tradition is addressing both of those kind of things equally, or is it tend to be more bound up with the latter, more kind of reflective?
I think there's been, I think in philosophy, the general tendency has been obviously to focus on the standards. Where do the standards come from? Are they just expressions of our emotion, our background? Do they have a right and a wrong about them? What's the source of authority? So that's been a lot of the focus in philosophy. But of course, there's also been focus on within philosophy in what we call philosophical moral psychology, which is the story about how exactly if we do have standards, do they connect with how we behave? As I said, it's not, as it were, as if we behave like actuaries, checking against the standards as we go along. That would be horrible in a way, wouldn't it? Dealing with someone, you ask them to do you a favor, and they say, let me just check to see if I'm required to do that. I mean, straight away, this isn't a very nice person, Actually, to be ethical people, in a way, it's important that we generally don't think of the standards, but they have to be there in the background, it seems to be, and to put up the flag when we're drifting from those standards, or for other people, of course, to get us to regulate ourselves by pointing out that the flag has gone up, that we're behaving unkindly, unfriendly, or whatever.
And are there any sort of dominant examples of ways of thinking about this within philosophy? So big feuds between rival ways of theorising over this, or?
Well, the focus on standards in particular, there's a big divide between those who are, as it were, well, the old words used in the 18th century were sentimentalists and rationalists. I mean, whereas sentimentalists think of moral standards as just expressions. There's no right or wrong. They're just expressions of how we feel. Whereas in general, rationalists or cognitivists, the various names, think of the standards as answering to facts of a certain kind. Now, of course, you could be a cognitivist in that sense because you are religious and thinks there's a fact about what God has required us to do, or you could be a more naturalistic type of cognitivist, and there are many varieties of that, but yeah.
Okay, and so do you think humans then, we're talking about the ethical human, there's something intrinsically morality seeking about us or ethical? Do you think we're sort of bound to behave in these ways, or is there space for much more amoral kinds of communities and individuals?
Well, I guess I'm in the school of that thinks of standards as being deeply anthropocentric. I mean, they reflect our nature, but they really have a grounding in our nature of a kind that ought to force a certain convergence between us. It's not as if everyone has their own ethic. And in a recent book called The Birth of Ethics, I'm sorry to advertise, but in any case...
this book is available outside after, and you can get a signed copy, but I will remind you of this before you leave the auditorium.
In that book, I tried an approach which I think of as naturalistic and, fitting very much with the sciences, but not quite traditionally philosophical. And what I try to do in the book with ethics is what, for example, economists do with money. I'll explain in a moment, or lawyers do, legal theorists with law. Because when you ask an economist, what's money? I'm thinking of that as corresponding to what's ethics. What the economist will tell you is, well, imagine a society without money, a barter society. And then they will tell you about the problems that people have exchanging, assuming they're human beings like us, creatures like us, the problems they're going to have in making exchanges, and then we'll tell you a story about how natural adjustment to those problems is going to mean that a certain commodity that it turns out a lot of people are interested in, like gold or cattle or cigarettes, as in post-war Germany, becomes a commodity everybody wants because they realize that they can always trade with it, and that's the first step in a long story about how you might get money emerging. And then at the end of that, the economist says, you wonder what money is? It's the thing that fills that sort of role. It plays a role of enabling us to exchange goods with one another. Or go to law. Herbert Hart, probably the best book ever written on the nature of law, the concept of law in the 1960s. What is law? He says, well, imagine a society without law. And he, again, postulates human beings like us, but without the structures we would describe as legal. And then he explains how they would face various problems of coordination, and the natural adjustment to those would be to have general norms of behavior, but also norms for how to interpret those norms, how to apply them, how to determine when someone has broken one. And he tells us so, and then he says, now, doesn't that look just like what a legal regime is? And he invites you to identify what we actually call law with what would emerge in that counterfactual thought experiment.
Something almost
fatalistic. What I try to do is to do a similar thought experiment with ethics.
So how does that work out with ethics then? Is ethics going to turn out to be like money, something that...
well, no, it's not like money, but I believe myself, philosophers deal in hypotheses as well, except they die in a different way from how, not in the laboratory, but in the laboratory of continuing discussion. in the sort of hypothesis of the story I tell, language is very, very important. Now, the two features that make us ethical, I would say, that show up, so to speak, that reveal our ethical nature, and that I don't think you see generally in animals, are, first of all, because we've got standards, we are creatures who often are attracted to X, but actually we think we should do Y, right? The traditional contrast between the flesh is weak, the spirit is strong and the flesh is weak. Or is it the other way around? And the standard can come apart from behavior. That experience of conflict between, let's call it, between values and desires. And the other feature is that not only do we have a sense of what's valuable as a thing for what's just attractive to us, but we also have a sense of holding one another responsible to our values, as in, you can't do that. You shouldn't have done that. You could have done otherwise. That's the responsibility aspect of. And they both involve standards interacting with behavior, as I said at the beginning. Now, the story I tell very briefly, because I know we've restricted time, makes language crucial. And what I argue, say, on the first theme, this really is very telegraphic now, I hope it's not unintelligible. I argue in the first theme that creatures like us, and I draw on psychology and indeed evolutionary theory to paint a realistic picture, I think, of creatures like us who come on language for the first time and use it merely for transmitting information about their respective situations. And what I argue on the first theme, the value theme, is that creatures of this kind are going to have a big interest in making themselves credible to others, so communicating what they desire, for example, in a way that the other can really be persuaded. And I argue that the ways in which creatures like that would tend to do it is by talking about their desire, communicating the desire in a very special first-person way. Like I might talk about what Clare desires, and the prediction being she'd do such and such. You say, you complain to me, she didn't do that. You were wrong about what she desires. Well, I can say, I must have got it wrong. The evidence must have misled me, or she must have changed her mind. But if I say to you, you ask me, so you're going to watch the rugby game, between England and New Zealand on, is that Saturday, whenever? And I say, God, yes, that'll be fun, And then it turns out I'm totally indifferent to it. You say, yeah, you let me know that you desire that, in a way that I could rely on you as were to be there to watch it with me, say. And you didn't, and I say, God, I must have gotten myself wrong. You can't do that. That's what I think of as an avowal. And I argue these creatures are going to not just report their own desires, but have a real interest in avowing them, speaking with authority for themselves. And then I say, any creatures like that are going to have the following experience. They'll often have avowed one desire, for example, the desire to help you move the apartment on next Sunday, and here they are lying in bed with another desire, not the desire they avowed, an experienced desire, which is to stay in bed, and have a nice restful Sunday morning rather than going and helping you. And that's a conflict now, isn't it? Very like the conflict I described at the beginning between value and desire. On this picture, it emerges, or would emerge in these creatures, as a conflict between the desire you avowed when someone asked you, would you mind? I said, that'd be great. I absolutely love it. I'll be there. And you don't do it. That's exactly a sort of conflict. So I argue that the practice of making yourselves credible to others that these creatures would have would lead them into reporting about themselves in this especially credible way, because they put aside the excuse, I must have gotten myself wrong. That opens up a difference between the desires you avow, or promise if you like, and the desires you experience, and thereby you edge in. Creatures like this are going to edge into the experience of values conflicting with desires. So that's the one story, and then I tell a different story about why, again based on language, on why we would hold one another responsible. And the core of that story basically is this, that if we're linguistic creatures like I've described, we depend on one another to live up to the desires the other avowed, I mean, we make our plans around one another's avowed desires and so on, then of course we're going to exhort one another to act appropriately if it's not clear. So, someone is going to turn up at an interview and, I know they don't want to tell the truth about, let's say, their past job or something. I say, go on, you can tell the truth. You must tell it. It's really important. They will find out and you'll be let down. And I say, you can tell the truth. That's exhortation, right? It's not just saying as a matter of fact, you're able to tell the truth. It's trying to help get them there. It's really impatiently eliciting or exhorting them to tell the truth. Now, if you get a story, as I develop, in which creatures of this kind are going to be mutually exhortatory, forever, pressing one another to do things they rely on the other doing, then if the other fails to do it after the event, a natural thing to say is not to give up on the other person. I mean, that would actually lose out on future exchange and benefits, but to say, you could have done otherwise, which is like saying before it, you can do it, which is exhortatory. Well, I think when you hold someone responsible, it's like retrospective exhortation. You could have done it. I'm not giving up on you, you're saying. You are someone who can be brought around to the standard. So that's the idea, this counterfactual story now is these creatures, like us, they come on language, as we know our forebears obviously did, and within the linguistic practice, there's a powerful urge to move to avowing desires, not just reporting desires. I'm just focusing on that aspect of our psychology, which means that there's going to be the experience of conflict, like between value and desire, and there's equally going to be a practice in which they exhort one another, and therefore to live up to what they have avowed, to live up to the standards that they more or less commonly avow. And then there's going to be a practice of exhorting, not just of exhorting one another, but holding one another responsible, blaming one another when you fail to live up to those standards. So that's what I think of, that's the sort of package that in this little thought experiment I suggest, well now, isn't that an account maybe of where ethics comes from and what ethics is about?
It's really interesting, and especially the sort of parallel case with law and economics and thinking about a sort of hypothetical development. I'm wondering, just to open it up, probably less relevant in the language in the case of the non-human apes, but in work with children or adults, is language and attitudes towards linguistic conventions and maybe credibility, are these things that play sort of key roles in your thinking about these topics?
I find language really fascinating in the context of morality, and in a different way to what Philippe mentioned, namely in the context of what's been called the social brain hypothesis. And that's Robin Dunbar's idea. This is a philosopher who proposed that language is a tool to help us connect to people when the group is getting too large to actually have direct contact with other people, and therefore draw conclusions of whom you can trust. So language comes in when we basically have to talk to each other about, what Philip has been up to, that guy or she. So it's all about gossiping and trying to figure out, who's the good guy, or especially who's the bad guy, because that's where it really matters. And language has been, Dunbar has proposed that that's what language is for, to exchange social information about other people and about their moral character and what they're up to, and especially if they're up to no good. And it's called the social brain hypothesis in part because so much of the brain is dedicated to keeping track of social relationships, or to deal, making sense of social relationships. And the proposal there is to say that, well, one reason why we as humans have such big brains is because we have such elaborate and complex social relationships where we have to make sure we keep track of whether somebody's a good person or a bad person. And with all of this, there is negativity bias. In general, we know as psychologists that negative information weighs more heavily than positive one, simply because it indicates that there's a problem. So when something, is negative in whatever way, negative emotions, for example, tell me that if I feel sad, there's a problem. If I feel angry, there's a problem. If I feel, any sort of negative state, that tells me there's a problem that needs fixing, as opposed to feeling good, feeling reasonably happy and content means that, well, by definition, it's all good. So when it comes to moral character, there's a massive negativity bias there as well. So we're very alert to who's a bad person or even who might be a bad person, even if there's a slight chance. So it's a very sensitive system as well. It's been called the smoke detector principle, better safe than sorry. If there's any suspicion that somebody's up to no good, better be safe than sorry. And that's where it comes back to language, to say that we use language to make sure we're all on the same page, that we all know whom to trust or whom to stay away from.
Zanna, I wanted to respond. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, it's interesting actually talking about brain evolution, because actually there's a lot of discussion from the biological sort of, obviously about the evolution of brain size, and actually the current hypothesis has really sort of discredited the social brain hypothesis, and the leading one is actually that it's to do with feeding ecology and sort of the evolution of sort of dexterity and foraging situations. And it's actually, there's some really interesting models that are now suggesting that, although it seems like a very obvious one, the actual data is suggesting it's more to do with being able to do much more complex forms of extractive foraging, which then give you these opportunities to manipulate your world better and so on. But just so I think it's a work in progress.
Yeah, this is interesting.
There's a number of massive debates going on about why we've got such big brains.
So what about language then? Yeah. Where does language fit in?
Well, I think
that's linked to the.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think so. I think it doesn't immediately link to primate brain size evolution if you look at it in a bigger picture, because if you look at relative brain size in lots of different species of primate rather than just humans, we just fit into a model. So I think it should be an explanatory model that can predict not just our own brain size evolution but other primates as well. So but I do think, I think it's really interesting, and I certainly, studying social cognition, social processes in primates, I can see how much it matters to them. And I think for me, language is, again, sort of building on what you said and Philip said, and sort of bringing in sort of the Mike Tomasello approach to language, is this idea that language is a cooperative act. It's about informing and sharing information voluntarily with others. It's about providing information almost as a pro-social behaviour, that you're giving information, valuable information that you think someone else might need or want to know, to them voluntarily, whereas most other animals are actually what we think of as pretty good at sort of eavesdropping, figuring out what they could extract from someone else's signal. But the kind of intent to inform, while it's not entirely absent, certainly it's present in some cases, it's much more limited. And so to me, I think language in the same way builds upon this idea of these kind of social contracts of giving information to others and building on these sort of these standards of cooperating, I suppose. So I think that's one thing to me. And then I thought, and something else is interesting, I thought about what you're talking about, counterfactual thinking. So with children, counterfactual thinking is being able to think of what you should have done or could have done in the past, sort of basically thinking of alternative outcomes to future or past events. So if I had have done that, I could have done this. And it's something that we do all the time, and I think it's, as you say, very involved in the way we think about moral standards or what you should have done or could have done. And actually we know that children really, really struggle with counterfactual thinking. It's something that develops really quite late in children. It's something that only to about, sort of 6 or 7, they're starting to actually be able to think conceptually about, if I had have done this, this would have been a different outcome. And it's surprising how late it develops for children. And it's almost as if children seem to have the initial moral standards that they're willing to apply before they're able to think conceptually in these more ethical, perhaps more ethical ways, truly ethical ways, about applying standards. But I find it interesting that children seem to, even from around the age of 3 to 4, have the motivation, say, to punish, to protest, to instill social rules that they think are, normative in their groups. But they still need to get to a later stage where they're truly able to think more flexibly about future or past expectations of themselves and others. So, and then primates,
they're somehow, they're not completely absent from these capacities, but it's certainly not. I don't think primates can think counterfactually.
It's interesting because it seems like we often do try and teach children ethics in quite a counterfactual way. So, when you're explaining punishment or why somebody doesn't get to do the thing they really wanted to do, it's like, well, if you had have given
it's difficult
Tim the
for
toy,
children to think in that way.
But it's fascinating
to think in abstract
we might
ways.
Have a mismatch.
Most children,
the golden rule. I mean, how would you feel if he had done that to you?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's
it's surprisingly late developing, I think, compared to some other aspects of child development. Even though they seem to be able to instill, they can. They can think about what, basic normative rules. I think they can start understanding those. But thinking of alternative outcomes seems to be quite a complex task, actually. So I find that interesting,
No, it's fascinating. We might just see if we have a few questions just early on now. Anyone got a burning start? Okay, we've got one here. I'll take them in batches, so maybe if you have 2 or 3, I'm happy to do that. One with the red top here. So just if you... And then maybe there's a woman or somebody in the red shirt up there.
Thank you. So I still don't really get what would be lacking if we had laws, means of exchanges, and language, but no ethics. What would be different? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then I did this question here. We've got 2 there, and then we'll treat them together. Can you just maybe go around to this person in the middle? Can you stick your hand up just so they can see you? Yeah, these 2 hands here. Thanks.
Hi. I had an argument once with one of my friends about whether or not you need evil for good, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Okay, thanks. I have it somewhere else.
Whether you
need evil for good.
Do you think
evil.
Whether you need evil for good between theistic and non-theistic ethics?
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. So just to summarise for the podcast and then for anyone who didn't hear, so the first question was about law without ethics. So can we have, function systems of law devoid of ethical thought? Another about whether evil is a sort of necessary condition of good, whether we can understand the good without the evil. And then the last case, whether we should be thinking of religious and irreligious morality as sort of separate kinds of things. So feel free to jump in on any one there that you'd like to take up.
Shall I take?
Yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps I can also respond to Zanna and Simone at the same time. Let's go in the backwards direction. On the theistic, non-theistic, I do think that it's a big divide. There's a difference in metaphysics between those people who think there is a God and those who think there isn't a God. It's a different reality, so to speak. Now, of course, that's going to lead to different interpretations of ethics. My own thought is this, that if the story I told, reveals something about ethics, it doesn't necessarily undermine, so to speak, theistic ethics. It will explain only why we develop what I call the ethical toolkit. We develop the sense of, we can have values that are different from our desires, and we can hold one another responsible and be held responsible to our values. That's the ethical toolkit, those 2 big conceptual developments. And that can be given a theistic interpretation by those who take that sort of theistic view. On evil and good, I don't know if I want to get into this, but I do think it's a really interesting topic. My own view is that in order for someone to count as doing good in many areas, for example, helping someone, you really have to be fairly robustly disposed to help them. You don't count as a helper just because it suited you, so you help them out. That doesn't show you up, so to speak, as being ethically good. We expect you to be robustly disposed to do good. With evil, the interesting thing is all you have to do is one fall. If you tell a lie, that's bad, but you're not an honest person just because you tell one truth, since it suits you to be an honest.
There's a word for that now. There's a word for that. It's called the cancel culture.
The what?
The cancel culture.
Cancel culture.
One strike and you're out.
Well, I didn't mean it in a harsh way, though, let me say.
I'm exaggerating here, but
Yes.
it's back to that negativity bias, right? That something bad weighs really heavily. A bad behavior, we consider a bad behavior much more diagnostic of the person than a good one, right? Because you can, as you said, you can do good things because you want to appear good, you want others to be impressed. But to do bad things, well, there's only, the most obvious explanation is you're a bad person.
Those in the audience who know the philosophy, psychology around this may know about the so-called Nobe effect, which is related to this. What I've just said, if it's correct, would give a sort of diagnosis of the Nobe effect, but I'm not going to go into the detail of that. Now, on the question about law without ethics, I'm sympathetic, and I think so was Herbert Hart. I mean, in his story about the emergence of law, it's very important. I'm not going into the detail again, but it's very important that people in his little counterfactual genealogy or story would actually develop an internal perspective on the law, meaning they wouldn't obey the law just because they get punished otherwise. They would internalize it as a normative system. And that, in a way, is giving it an ethical dimension. Now, again, more to be said, but that's the basic point to make. If I can just comment very briefly on what Zanna and Simone had to say, I think it's very important, I'm entirely with Zanna, that in any plausible story about the emergence of ethics, it's built on a pro-social disposition in creatures of our kind, which shows up, as I'm sure we'll learn, in other primates as well. I don't think ethics could ever have happened without, so to speak, that pro-sociality there. I also think to move on to what Simone said, that's my own view, that ethics wouldn't have happened, so to speak, in the dual sense I'm thinking of standards and behaviour, unless language had come on stream. And I think that's really very interesting, the Dunbar story that she gave us of the need for language emerging because of our becoming more complex and geographically spread out sort of community where you get trading across hundreds of miles and that sort of thing. But it matches, actually fits very nicely, I think, with the line that I sketched myself, because after all, suppose that we're really interested in, is Clare Moriarty reliable? Did you ever have anything to do with her previously? Can you trust her? Basically, if we're talking about one another in that gossipy way, which is part of the Dunbar hypothesis, as it were, and we become sensitized to how people gossip about others, then of course we're each going to realize this, and it's going to be really important for Clare to try to establish to me that she is reliable, right? She's going to speak for herself. And one way of doing it is she won't say, well, I think it is hard that such and such, and so she lets herself off the hook if she doesn't live up to that. She says, yes, that's what I want, or, that's what's right or fair, or whatever, communicating that you have a desire to do that you can't, so to speak, get off the hook for failing to manifest by saying, oh, I must have gotten myself wrong. You can't do that. And so there's going to be, these two stories support one another, I think, quite a lot. If I could just add on the point that Zanna made, I build quite a bit of Tomasello into the story. And in fact, Tomasello has a response to the book at the end, to which I in turn respond. But I'm very much on the same track, or at least try to keep on track. Of course, I'm trying to defer to the empirical scientist, so to speak. Although I have doubts about the fact he doesn't make language so central. I mean, his theory would make good sense of that, but actually he backs off a bit and wants to say that ethics can come on stream independently of language. I think that's implausible myself.
Well, we'll give you your chance to get your own back now by opening up some of these psychological pictures, and then you can come in afterwards. But Simone, those of us who don't work in experimental social psychology, can you tell us a bit about how you approach topics like morality and ethics within that sort of academic culture?
Right, so it's very different from philosophy, of course. So we do experiments with human subjects, usually university students, other times people from the general population, And we ask them various questions. So often it's survey-based. Other times we put them in certain experimental situations and observe their responses. So that's a lot of fun. And also, so that's in terms of the method, but also in terms of the kind of theoretical perspective. It's quite different, I think, in terms of the approach. Or I suppose, at least in the last maybe 10, 15 years or so, there's been a lot of research in social psychology on morality. It's really been an emerging topic, and coming especially from a particular perspective which to some extent leads back to the sentimentalist perspective that Philippe mentioned, which is the idea that feelings play a central role when it comes to morality. So certain intuitions, certain gut feelings, and all kinds of other contextual factors that are not driven by rational thinking. So all kinds of influences that may be more subtle or more unconscious to people. And there's now a lot of research to suggest that those can be really powerful, play powerful roles in morality.
How does that come out in experiments? Or I suppose often we think about emotions as being quite private in a way that it's hard to automatically see somebody emoting. So I'm just interested in how experiments kind of...
That's right. So one is to in fact, as you said, observe somebody as they are emoting, as they're showing certain emotional responses. But another way is to do it the other way around and to elicit certain emotional responses in participants and then see how what role that plays in their moral judgments, for example.
Can I just do you discriminate between emotions and feelings?
Emotions are typically considered more specific, like something like anger, fear, happiness. Feelings are more diffuse and more subtle, or moods. They're often called moods. Or feelings can be even broader. For example, feeling thirsty, feeling bored. Those are, more like bodily sensations rather than emotions. But as far as I'm concerned, any of these could in principle play a role in all kinds of cognitive processes, including moral decision making. And just to give an example of the kinds of feelings or emotions that psychologists, including myself, have studied, one very basic emotion that we've looked at is the emotion of disgust. So feeling physically repulsed, feeling sick to your stomach, feeling that something is just really, really objectionable on a gut level. And we have shown, and now many other researchers have replicated that finding, that when you elicit a strong gut feeling of disgust, a physical sensation of disgust, while at the same time asking participants to judge certain moral actions, when they feel physically disgusted, for example, because we sprayed a bad smell in the air or because we set up the lab environment such that there was rubbish lying around everywhere, or we got participants to think of a time when they felt physically disgusted and sick to their stomach. So these are all different techniques of inducing that sense of physical disgust. So with all these kinds of inductions, manipulations, we find that it makes people more harsh in their moral judgment. So asking them, for example, how wrong is it to not return a lost wallet that you find in the ground and has a lot of cash in it? How wrong is it to falsify your CV in order to get a better job? Those kinds of questions. If I make you feel physically disgusted because I sprayed fart spray in the air, we really do that. And again, that kind of work is a lot of fun. So now, and it may sound kind of, amusing, but the point is you want to, in a way, get participants to conflate that sense of physical disgust that comes from something that's completely irrelevant, like that smell, and combine it with that judgment they're making. How wrong is it to falsify your CV? How wrong is it to not return a lost wallet? And when you get that experimental paradigm where the two all of a sudden become confused, and I feel physically repulsed, and I feel sick to my stomach, and I feel this is really wrong. So it's testing the idea that a feeling can have a causal influence on the moral judgment. And I should say there's been a lot of work now looking at physical disgust, inducing ways of physical disgust. There's lots of ways of doing that. Probably one of my favorite studies that just came out a few months ago is by my colleague Jessica Tracy and her co-workers, and they found that instead of increasing disgust and making moral judgments more harsh, you can decrease physical disgust by giving participants ginger pills. So ginger is known to reduce nausea. And what they showed was, first, that if you show participants disgusting photos, physically disgusting photos, mutilated bodies or maggots crawling out of meat, when they had ginger pills, they would find them less disgusting, as opposed to a group that had placebo pills. And this is really beautifully done work because it's double-blind. Participants didn't know what pill they were getting, experimenters didn't know what pill participants were getting, and so on. So physically disgusting stimuli became less aversive after taking a ginger pill, and by the same token, moral transgressions became less objectionable after taking a ginger pill as well. So it's that same kind of causal mechanism to see that if you play with that feeling, that gut feeling in particular of disgust, which we consider very powerful, then you can shape the moral judgment in one way or another.
It's fascinating. It's the idea that sort of a contamination occurs between these two kind of, this thing about being grossed out or really horrified and then being sort of overly judgmental. It really makes you think about the social consequences of people's living in really bad conditions, right?
Right, yes. So disgust is an interesting emotion because it is, in principle, or the way it originated, very basic, very physical. It's very embodied. It is all about protecting the body from harm. Right? It's about not eating things that might make you sick because they smell bad or they look bad, not touching surfaces that might be contaminated, not exposing yourself to people who might carry infectious disease. All these situations elicit disgust because it's potentially dangerous. It could potentially kill you to engage with these kinds of stimuli. And then, so that's on a very basic level. But when it comes to morality, you take it to an abstract level and say that engaging with people who are, who are wrongdoers, who are doing horrible things, that's also potentially harmful. So it's a general system to do with avoiding harm and protecting yourself, and disgust covers multiple layers in that goal.
So I hadn't necessarily seen these topics as related when we were discussing it in the prep, but it seems that they might be. So we discussed maybe a changing sort of sphere of morality in which now, maybe owing to social media and increased connectivity, people are sort of hyper-moral in a way that maybe would be possible to connect to disgust. Could you comment a bit on,
Well, there is certainly a sense that people are becoming hyper-moral. It hasn't been studied a lot, but I think many of us who studied scientifically, but then also lay people one talks to, seem to have a sense that, in the way, given that the way that information spreads, it's much more bad news, or rather bad information about other people, rumors, accusations, and so on, can be spread very quickly. So people seem to be very quick to moralize and to condemn others and to, call out others, calling out people, or the cancel culture. These kinds of terms seem to get thrown around quite a bit. So it is an interesting question whether society has become more moralized. I suspect that's the case. Again, it hasn't really been studied systematically, I don't think. But I think in part, and it goes back to the language to Dunbar's idea of language, that language is about transmitting moral information about other people. So it's not just about transmitting information in general, but especially information that you need in order to stay safe, because if somebody's up to no good, then we all need to know about it. That's why rumors spread very quickly. And it's known, for example, on social media, fake news spread more quickly than factual news, or accusations spread more. It's more interesting, it's more fun, it gets shared, it gets the likes, because on some level we know this can be really critical information. But that, of course, poses the danger that, well, when all this information gets spread and it's so easy to hit a button or to click a like and so on, then that can have really detrimental consequences for people. That never used to be the case. So when we, in the kind of context in which we evolved, where language was just about, communicating with a small group of people, that was fine if there were some rumors going around. But now you can reach hundreds of thousands, millions of people by just, the click of a button.
Zanna, I wonder, is this something you see in the children case, or as a comparative psychologist, that this increased access to information and sort of onslaught of detail, linguistic or otherwise, is kind of changing considerations at all? Or
what do you mean in terms of
the idea that maybe the way children are growing up now and their exposure to different opinions and sort of the readiness of...
I think it's difficult. It's more difficult for children to know how to navigate in these situations, and I think also we there's a lot more overprotection of children in these senses. There's less opportunity for them to explore in their own way. Like, I think there's a lot more prescribed ways of doing. Of behaving morally and things like this. So, for example, in a very different note, like we're doing research on, we're looking at empathy in toddlers in nurseries in the northeast, and we find it very difficult to actually observe it because there's all of the caregivers interfere, but they actively teach the children, this is how you should, if this happens, you must go and do this, and then they approach, and then it means that the children have actually quite difficult time exploring these experiences on their own terms, and I think they get given a lot of this, you can't do that, you have to do this, and now you go and hug him, and actually what we find is that the children, it's mostly given to them in a prescribed form, and so I find it like, I think you're right that there's this quite a lot of potential implications about, particularly in childhood, of enabling children to actually learn these things in their own way and have these different experiences. So I think it is it's a changing landscape in some ways it's good to be hyper aware, but I think it also puts a lot of pressure on people as well to be and then feel subject to bullying and all this sorts of things.
So do you find that children show less empathy then?
Well, I think it's difficult for us to it's difficult to know, because I think at the moment our data is we're trying to, we're working in different settings, and actually one of the reasons I actually do some work in cross-cultural research now, because we're interested in looking at, for example, how children respond to distress or needs of others, and I think looking only in a Western context where you've got active interventions from adults is probably limiting us in understanding this. So, we're trying to look at it in other cultures as well, because I think because of this, one of the reasons is because it's changing quite a lot in it might also be because we're, the caregivers, for example, want to make sure that, they look good in our eyes. We're their scientists looking at the infants, and the caregiver in the nursery wants to ensure that they're viewed well, which again comes back to this idea of reputation, of feeling like we have to do this as an obligation to show that we're good caregivers, which is perfectly understandable. But it just it's this cycle, I suppose, of an ethical question or standards or values that I think people are very sensitive to, and so it's interesting that we're finding these shifts, I suppose.
You can definitely see if people's moral or empathetical behaviour is better explained by sort of authoritarian enforcement.
Well, I think we know that, for example, I know you do some work on moral elevation, and developmental psychologists, I'm starting to do some work on this as well, but children, we know, have these there's evidence that young children have these arousal or affective based responses that seem to motivate pro-social behaviour. So, for example, I don't know if you know the work of Robert Hepak, and in Germany there's some nice work of a colleague of mine who's doing some work on what's called pupil dilation. So when people observe something that emotionally arouses them, your pupils increase in size. And so what they found is when children observe situations where someone needs to be helped, or they could have helped but they actually didn't help, they get a very large increase in this pupil size, the dilation of the pupils, suggesting that it's very actually emotionally arousing for them not to be able to help. And then when they're given an opportunity to either see someone being helped or themselves to help, you find that arousal goes down. So what it's suggesting is that there is this emotional basis, that motivates pro-social behaviour, and that's probably not learned or trained or anything, that it's a kind of basic motivation, I suppose. And we're trying to do similar work with great apes and see, they also show these pupillary responses to others' needs and desires and so on. So I think it's... I guess what I think is, I think there are these two levels. Of course, having an institutionalised or a taught form of these behaviours will influence them, but I think we also need to give enough space for the behaviours to develop in their own terms. So I guess it's trying to...
See, I have to say I'm very intrigued by your observation that from what you're saying, it sounds like parents are interfering with their children development.
I mean, I think they're trying their very best to be good parents, but I do think...
But it sounds like it has the result of kind of getting in the way of the children.
I mean, as an ethologist, I'm interested in how individuals, young animals, humans or otherwise, are developing their own mechanisms, and I think one of them is giving them an opportunity to do it in a way without it being taught to them. And I suppose, it's difficult because, of course, we all want to do the best for children, but I also think there's something to be said for letting them get on with it.
Right.
I don't know if you agree, but yeah.
Just going back to Simone's emphasis on disgust, I mean, it's entirely plausible, isn't it, that even if a story of the kind I like, or I don't know that we're different on that, but that language is important and so on, it's still going to be really plausible that, so to speak, our reactions to other people in correcting them and expecting to have an effect, say, in exhorting them, are going to build on systems that already precede the emergence of that set of ideas, like the pro-social tendencies and so on. One of the things I'd really be interested to know whether Simone's research has pointed in this direction. When you talk about the disgust and the way in which the disgust system, so to speak, interacts with the moral system, as you might say. So I feel disgust, and I therefore am inclined to be tougher in my moral judgment, and maybe there's the opposite effect of some kind as well, I'm not sure. But is this a case of these systems, so to speak, coming into an unhappy conflict, as you might put it, in the sense that you think of the disgust as producing a moral bias? We talk about cognitive biases, as in if you think of a very vivid danger, you rate it as if it's more probable just because it's more vivid. So we fear flying, or might fear flying, more than we do driving in a car, though actually the probability of getting hurt is higher in the car, but the other is more vivid. I mean, that's a bias we know about. I wonder if you could think about the role of disgust generating a sort of moral bias, that the systems are interfering in a way.
Right.
The moral system is built on something that precedes it, but obviously they're going to be, as it were, not in that system of alignment between the emerging moral system and what
I
precedes
suppose
it.
It sounds like on a basic level the question is there something adaptive about that disgust response, or is it useful to layer the moral system onto the more basic disgust system? And, well, that's an important question. I suppose on some level it appears that that is what has evolved. So that would suggest there's some benefit to it. That doesn't mean it's a perfect system. So I think I think a lot of the times, I mean, and these kind of situations where there is, of course, we know about all these cognitive biases, but by the same token, while they may be harmful or unhelpful in many cases, often they are quite useful, right? There are these heuristics or rules of thumb. They may not always work, but often it's a reasonably good bet.
Could I ask you one question just to follow on that? So, for example, is there any evidence of the disgust system interfering with a pre-moral response, which is one of just sympathy for somebody in pain? For example, if you're disgusted by a situation, is there any study at all indicating, does that make people less sympathetic with the person who, as well as arousing disgust at the same time as arousing sympathy or empathy?
I think it's hard to have sympathy and disgust at the same time.
Right.
I think disgust is so, it repels you, right? It keeps you away from the person. It's almost the opposite of sympathy.
I know. It could be a very sad result, that, couldn't it? Because, I mean, after all, those who deserve our sympathy are often, in a miserable state and in a way
what
disgusting.
About, for example, like situations, say, for example, vegetarianism. There's a strong disgust reflex of many vegetarians towards, animal cruelty or eating meat, but then they can still feel this strong sort of sympathy, I suppose, towards the animals in these cases. I wonder about something like that.
I think the disgust, though, is against people eating meat, right? Or the action of the behavior of eating meat. That's what's disgusting, not the animal that's disgusting, right? Because you have sympathy or empathy with the animal, that's why eating meat is disgusting. So I think that the two are actually separating the behavior versus the living creature that's being harmed and that's suffering. But back to your point of, is it useful or is it adaptive or is it a bias? Again, I think it's one of these situations where there is some benefit or some quick and dirty way in which it's useful a lot of the times, but then, of course, there are plenty of situations where it is not.
As most of the biases are, right.
That's what these biases are. And I think in the context of the cognitive biases, I'm sure many of you have come across Danny Kahneman's work, and whenever I talk to people who aren't psychologists, they pretty much all know the book Thinking Fast and Slow. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. So there, in a way, the punchline is that we have lots of cognitive biases that we are not aware of and that can get in the way. But it's also worth keeping in mind. So kind of the counterpoint to Kahneman's idea of biases was made by Gerd Gigerenzer. And he proposed that many of these biases are adaptive. There is a point you can construct situations in experiments to say that, people do silly things, but for the most part, these are pretty useful rules of thumb. So to say it's a bias and it's, not useful and we're doing silly things, that's a bit limiting, I think.
Okay, and I wonder, we might move on to Zanna's material now and then take a Q&A at the end. Can you introduce us a little bit to the idea of the research that you've been doing on sort of comparative cases between non-human and human apes?
Yeah, sure. So, although I've talked quite a lot about children, because I'm interested in children and development, in parallel I'm also interested in sort of evolutionary processes that might lead to things like moral behaviours and empathy and pro-sociality. And one of the reasons I suppose I'm interested in it is because I think there's been a sort of quite a strong sort of history, at least in the public domain, of viewing animals in this sort of selfish gene concept and focusing heavily on sort of competitive aspects of animal life, whereas the humans are often viewed as these elevated beings, and some people argue that this is this kind of myth of human versus animal and this competitive nature. And I think a lot of people forget that actually animals are also have extraordinarily kind of complex, rich and social lives, which require quite deep forms of pro-social behaviour, altruism, empathy, sharing, and actually these are fundamentally crucial for many social organisms. And so I'm interested in trying to unpick, I suppose, some of the evolutionary origins of some of those capacities that we find in our own species, but also in other animals. So, yeah, I've done kind of quite a lot of work thinking about empathy in non-human animals and in children, which I'm doing at the moment. And I've brought a few videos to show you.
This is the good bit.
Yeah. No, but so I suppose in terms of thinking about morality, there's sort of two levels really. And I think when we're talking about humans, we often think of this sort of higher level, this normative-based forms of morality, of ethics and standards and socially accepted values, sort of almost impartial forms of normative, of expected rules and expected ways that one should treat others. But I think if you take a step back, actually we as humans, but also many other animals, have this more immediate form of moral behaviour, which is to do with your day-to-day interactions. So how you treat others in pro-social ways, for example, how you cooperate. And my area of research, we do lots of work on cooperation, on pro-sociality, on empathy. So yeah, I just thought it was relevant maybe for the discussion to show you a few sort of clips of the sort of things that we do to look at moral behaviour, sort of early forms of moral behaviour in animals. So I mean so they're a bit different than as I say, these high level normative things. And to me, I'm fascinated in when children start to become aware of themselves in this sort of more reputation-based world where they have to ascribe, adhere, and administer rules that they think are relevant for their social group. And animals like chimpanzees and bonobos show basic forms of conformity. They are aware of sticking to group-based behaviours. It's not that it's absent, it's just it's less sort of institutionalised, I suppose. But anyway, I'll show you a couple of videos if you want. So this up here is what I do a lot of my work on. It's a great ape, your closest living relative. It's a bonobo. I don't know how many people in this room have heard of bonobos. Yeah? Oh, good. We have good bonobo fans. Excellent. So I'm interested, this photo is showing a number of things that I'm interested in animals, but it's the caregiving context, and I think a lot of sort of the roots of pro-sociality do probably originate from these forms of immediate care that mothers, particularly mothers or caregivers, have for their offspring, and obviously the role that learning plays in learning about how to interact socially with others. And so I'm sort of interested in the evolution of these processes and their development in young animals, including humans, but certainly not restricted to that. And I study chimpanzees and bonobos, again, our closest living relatives here, who present to us some quite interesting comparisons with things like sort of the basis of morality and pro-social behaviours, competition and conflict. Bonobos are kind of interesting because they are considered relatively empathic, emotionally oriented species, less aggressive than chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, by comparison, these are our two closest living relatives, the great apes, chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees are known to be physically aggressive and quite competitive, but they're also extremely good at cooperating. So people are interested in why cooperation's evolved in these species, and chimpanzees seem to suggest to us that cooperation is a benefit. It ultimately serves a competitive goal. And so I think that's, again, something to think about in terms of morality. But I'm interested, I just wanted to play you a quick video of sort of a case of something that I study, is how animals respond to others' distress. So things that we showed you in I'm talking about infants, human children approaching others in states of distress. And this is one way that we look at empathy or pro-social orientation towards the needs of others, which I think is a key basis for future moral behaviours in human development and also in evolutionary terms. I think we need to feel affected by others' states and a motivation to restore them to a better state. And so we look at things like how animals deal with conflict. So in this clip, you're going to see an older female. She's going to aggress a young juvenile down here, and then there'll be two bonobos who are going to run over and show some what I call empathic responding. which serves to reduce the distress of the individual. So hopefully this will work. Let's see. Okay, so that's the aggression. Now watch this little guy. So he runs over and you can see she's screaming. And he's kind of hugging her. Sorry, it's a bit of a beating. And he's sitting pretty still actually, and he's not showing distress himself. But the point is he actually moved towards her and he hugged her, and you can see he's actually on here. And actually this guy is someone you want to just take a moment at him. He's going to approach as well. Watch what he does to her now.
There it is.
So she's got her two buddies. And another key thing that this bonobo is doing is he's sitting next to her. This one's hugging her. They're proactively engaging with her in a way that that we know that is effective in reducing her own distress, and so we consider that an empathically motivated response because it's generally targeted at socially close individuals with whom you share close relationships with. So we're interested in behaviours like that. We're also interested in behaviours, for example, how animals restore harmony in their social groups after conflicts. So, for example, I'll just play you a quick clip, which again I think is related to sort of basis of morality and sort of restoring sort of social calm. This is a conflict, and you'll see a small reconciliation. So one individual is very upset, and then another one who's aggressive will actually reconcile the conflict and restore the social calm. This is a young chimp, she's very upset. She's been attacked. That's the aggressor there. And just watch her, she's upset. And this one now, look, the hand out. And then she actually, this is what chimps do, they touch each other's genitals quite often. But the point is she initiated a restoration of a social relationship. And so animals are motivated to engage with one another's needs and restoring their social world. And I think these are important things in terms of understanding morality. I've got one more, but I can show it
Sure,
later.
no, there's time.
I wanted to show you... do you want to see the capuchin cucumber one, or should I do that later? Or do you want to see the chimps with the tools?
All right, a vote then. Hands for capuchins. Couple of hands there.
Capuchins, okay.
Okay.
And the chimps with the tool is quite good. But just because I'm doing a bit of a whistle-stop tour, this is research done by my mentor and collaborator, Professor Frans de Waal. They have a nice study looking at the kind of evolution of fairness and justice, potentially. And there are a lot of different interpretations of why this monkey might behave as it does in this experiment. But this study was actually looking at whether animals are sensitive to fairness and whether they're sensitive to what we call inequity, so differential allocation of resources. So in this experiment, what happens is this guy, he's learnt to trade, we call pieces of cucumber, which he gets here, and he trades them very happily. He gives them back, and then his partner is sitting over here, and actually he does a trading task, but rather than getting cucumber, this monkey actually gets given grapes. It's exactly the same task, but grapes are way better for capuchins than cucumber. Not so different to probably how we might feel if we were given the same. So you can just watch what this capuchin does and how he responds to being given a less valuable reward. The key thing is he was perfectly happy trading cucumber before his partner started getting grapes. So hopefully it's working. So he's trading his cucumber, he's giving it back, and now the partner starts trading and gets grapes. You can see this one's noticed that he's not getting the same reward for the same task. He's starting to look, he's trading his rock, but he doesn't get grapes, he gets cucumber. cucumber, but no, he won't even accept it at all. So he's just not having any of it. So anyway, so the idea here is that this monkey is actually incurring a cost. He's actually foregoing a food reward because someone got more than him. And so I think this sort of shows to us that animals are sensitive to what they are getting and what they expect to get. And I think these are kind of, although there's a big leap into fairness, I think these are kinds of behaviours of monitoring the behaviours of others and developing expectations that I think animals can tell us a lot about in terms of like the evolution of moral behaviours. So I've got plenty of other videos, but I think we should probably move on to other things. I can show you the chimp tool one if we have time later. But it is quite a good video. But have we got time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I can show you one more because I like this video. This is a chimpanzee in a research laboratory in Japan, and this is a nice study where basically they're interested in whether chimpanzees understand the needs of others, so whether they actually are willing to help others receive rewards for which they don't get an immediate benefit. So again, it's that motivation to respond to others' needs, which I think forms a basis of pro-social or ethical, kind of the early origins of ethical behaviour. So essentially, this chimpanzee in this room is given an opportunity to access a tray here, and this tray is full of tools. And on the other side of a room is a chimpanzee who needs one of those tools. And the key thing is that there are different tools for different tasks over here. So if this chimp gives this chimpanzee on the other side the wrong tool, he can't actually access certain different types of rewards. So there's a straw, for example. There's a hook that he needs to hook something in. There's a rake that he needs to rake something in. So the goal is to ask, does this chimpanzee understand which tool this one needs for the specific task? And of course, it doesn't have to give anything. This guy can just sit there with all the toolbox. But you'll see what happens in this video is he gets given the toolbox. That's the toolbox. He doesn't have any rewards he can get himself. He's just got the tools. But the guy on the other side does need the tools, and he's inspecting a walking stick there. Again, he's just, has no real obligation to do anything with it. But what you'll see is a little hand will start emerging in just a minute. Here we go. Yeah, there's the hand. So that chimp needs that. He's got the straw. And importantly, this chimp at the moment can't actually see which... this is an opaque box here at the moment. So he can't actually see which tool the chimp wants. And so that chimp is quite clearly signaling to him that it's not the right one, actually. So he's dropped it, he's waiting. So he's giving him all different tools. So, and actually that's the correct one. So what we find in this task, which is kind of interesting, well, there's three things I find interesting in this, and now we want to go and see what's happening.
Fair.
Is when the barrier is actually clear and that chimpanzee can see what the other one needs, he's more likely to give him the correct tool first off. So he does seem to understand the specific needs of the other chimp. The second thing is he's actually motivated to help the other one. For what reason, we're not sure. It's something to investigate. And third, I think one key thing here is what's slightly different to what you find in children is what you can see there is there's quite a lot of pestering, like, I want this, please give it to me. We find that chimpanzees will help others, but it's generally when asked. Whereas actually young children are very willing often to help even when no one specifically asks them to do so. And I think this is quite a key shift in terms of evolution of things like helping. Chimpanzees will help, but it tends to be in slightly more constrained settings. And I think that's a point maybe of discussion for us to have. And I think it intersects a bit with empathy, because I think empathy is a more emotional kind of demand that I think motivates animals potentially to respond more quickly because they get affected, at this motivational level. perhaps more than in such a situation as this. So anyway, there's just a few food for thought. I haven't got time to talk too much more. I've got way more videos, but I can't talk about them. So I'll put it back up.
Maybe we can post some links afterwards, you never know.
Yeah. I'm happy to do more. I'll put an inspiring picture of a bonobo just because it's nice.
So I guess maybe... would you guys like to comment on any of that content, and then we'll open up for some final questions for everybody?
Yeah, sure.
I think there are two things that are very interesting in these videos. I mean, one of them is the fairness one with the capuchin monkeys. I mean, they don't. It seems entirely plausible that our fairness response, which children have very early, and of course they use the word fair and they learn the word fair, and they usually insist on fairness as were for themselves, you know, as the capuchin does. You know, it's because he or she it didn't get, you know, the grape that it's annoyed. I mean, you wouldn't expect it to be annoyed because the other person was getting cucumber.
And they don't care
grape.
if the other one doesn't get it.
That grape one seemed happy.
But it's still it seems to me to be the sort of pro-social system. Well, it's not pro-social in this case, it's more pro-me, but in any case, part of the system on which presumably morality develops, you know, as it develops with us. The other one that I think is really interesting, sorry, Simone, just on, is the last one you showed. I think one of the things, I have seen this clip before, and I think in your work, but one of the most interesting things about it, to me actually, isn't so much that he hands over, it's not as if he's all that excited about giving, it's the fact that he understands, you know, the first one is not reaching for the tool. It's clear it can't reach the tool. So when it's putting out of that, it's not reaching, it's not trying to get the tool, it knows it won't get it. So what's it doing? Well, presumably it's wanting the other person to realize that it wants to get the tool, and presumably the chimp to realize that. And presumably it's doing that because it's got some expectation that the other will respond to what it communicates now. And I think that's actually, I mean, so-called Gricean theory of language, that arguably is the first sort of stage into
intentionality,
learning, because what we do with words, obviously, is we manifest what we want when we ask someone for something, and we expect people to respond to that, and that is really proto-communication.
Yeah, it's like perspective taking and recognising the other's need, and we certainly know chimpanzees are pretty good at that. Actually, they can understand others' needs and goals and desires. It's not full-blown perspective taking in the human sense, but they've certainly got these capacities.
So nice to see that sort of stage brought out. Simone, did you want it?
Yes, I wanted to add to the video with the cucumbers versus the grapes. And, you know, of course we can look at it as a basis of fairness or a precursor to fairness, an understanding of fairness, and that is, of course, something as humans, we aspire to. But it's clear from the video it's a major source of misery to have a sense that there should be fairness, right? Because that animal was perfectly happy when he was getting the cucumbers. Only by seeing that somebody else got something better, it was not fair. It brought misery, tremendous misery. And it raises the question of whether all these moral goals or values we have are necessarily always such a good thing. In this case, it does look like I would say often, in fact, fairness relates to the idea of social comparison, right? By definition, you have to compare what I get as opposed to what you get. And if you get more than I do, well, that's not fair, and I don't like it. So there is a bit of, to me at least, a bit of, what shall I say, a dark side almost to this sense of fairness that, of course, we want to strive for, but at the same time, it means that I will often feel like I'm getting the short end of the stick, or I'm getting the cucumber.
It seems likely to me that people might have some questions at this point. Okay, so we got one over here. If we could pass the mic over. One down here. We'll try and get three there. One slightly here. Keep your hand up, please. Yeah. This one and the green. Sorry. Yeah. Oh yeah, far ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. It's been very interesting. The thing I keep wondering about is the kind of evolution of ethics. So if you look at societies across time or even space, different societies have different ethical and moral norms. So when we talk about ethical behaviors, who decides what is and isn't an ethical behavior? Because it is often certain societies still have the death penalty. In other societies, it's seen as morally abhorrent. So what even is an ethical human?
Okay, thank you. And then take this question as well.
Yes, hi. Just wonder if there are any major gender differences to the way that ethical behavior develops and is perceived. Is an ethical woman and an ethical man, or even within the animal kingdom?
Okay, thank you. I'll just summarise them in case they're not picked up for the podcast. So the first question is, we've talked about the evolution of ethics, but what about changes or differences in ethics over time, space and culture? Are we assuming one specific kind of doctrine of ethics when we start to do experiments or philosophise? And second question, do we see gender manifest itself in our understanding of ethics, whether it's in individuals or kind of communities of women versus men, maybe?
Well, I leave the second question to others. On the first one, though, it does raise, we haven't talked about social evolution at all. We've only spoken about natural evolution, and then, the rather abrupt sort of story about language and how it can elicit concepts and standards and so on. Surely morality, ethics has socially evolved as well, it seems to me. And I hope I'm not a Pollyanna, but I'm sort of optimistic on the whole. We become more inclusive, in the we and the they, though clearly there are massive sort of pressures against that. But for example, I like Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which indicates, that over time there have become very, very much less violent. Now, I don't think that's a result, and he doesn't either, of natural evolution, but of social evolution, that there are more people interacting with one another worldwide than was the case earlier. There are newer possibilities, of course, of interacting with one another peacefully and so on. And that has brought new modes of organization. I think that has brought overall, it's a very up and down trajectory, but I think the direction is really positive. That's what I feel. Now, when it comes to comparing societies, at any time, there was a period when you would have said, well, some societies think slavery is okay and other societies condemn it. Isn't this just... Almost no one thinks that slavery is okay nowadays, and I think that's simply by virtue of sort of generalization that is intellectually compelling once it's presented to you.
And then
I'm a progressivist on that. But.
Sorry, just because we're quite short on time, but would you either of you like to respond, or both of you indeed, to the issue of gender?
I would like to respond to that point of things getting better and society becoming better, which I'm sure is true in many ways. But I also seem to see a pattern, at least anecdotally. I'm not sure how much research is on that. And again, back to the idea of society becoming increasingly moralized. So certain behaviors becoming objectionable, or people getting condemned for certain things that might not be such a big deal, or didn't used to be such a big deal, where there seems to almost be a sense that almost a bit of a counter
overcompensation.
That's right, a compensation to say that, well, you're wearing a red sweater. Well, red sweaters used to be okay, but now they're out. Cancelled. You're cancelled. Not in such extreme ways, but where I think people become more sensitive and more judgmental sometimes, perhaps, which isn't necessarily always such a good thing. So I think one can overshoot a bit in terms of trying to enforce moral norms.
Oh, about gender, yeah. It's a very, very big topic, and I can sort of, I haven't got a kind of a concrete answer to that, but I do think in animals there are certain sex differences relating to maybe empathic behaviours, pro-social behaviours, aggressive behaviours. So, for example, we know that generally, at least in say chimpanzees, males generally are dominant and aggressively dominant, and so they can instill sort of justice, or instill their they can use their social power in aggressive forms that females don't generally do. And for example, in bonobos, the other relative, females exert power but do so generally in developing social relationships and showing different forms of sort of more investing in developing more peaceful relationships in general. They're not using aggression in the same way. So I think there are sex differences in animals to do with aggressivity and how they might in sort of impose that in terms of power dynamics. And so, for example, chimpanzees have quite an interesting behaviour called policing, which is where male chimpanzees, dominants, will often actually, if there's a fight going on, they will run in and actually sort of break up the fight, and it seems to be relatively impartial, so they don't have necessarily they're not vying for either side. So I find it kind of interesting that you do seem to get this interaction between sort of physical power and the ability to impose on others, in a social intervention. So I think there are certain differences, but it's different from what you're asking about gender, because I think I'm working with animals, so it's a different kind of concept. But I also think that there's still, and I don't know if you have words to add to that, but it's still very open whether women are truly more empathic and more emotional than men. I think it's a kind of common assumption, but actually a lot of the data is very, very mixed. And I think we shouldn't assume that women are more morally elevated, or I'm not saying that people do, but they might think that women are more empathic than men. And I have to say, from my own data, I have no evidence that the great apes are showing these trends. So I don't know if you have some data in the humans that you want to allude to, but I sort of think we need to really look at the data rather than,
I think not so much in terms of empathy, but what's well known for aggression is, for example, that males tend to be physically aggressive, but females tend to be more verbally aggressive, for example. There's different types of aggression, and it's not that one gender is more aggressive than the other. It's just different ways of dishing out the aggression.
Not necessarily an ethical one, but it is my duty at this point to say that we are out of time, so I might ask you to thank our speakers.